Hey everyone, we are going to be talking about the movie Lagaan in relation to three terms from Nair: subjectivity, agency, and infantilization. At the core, Lagaan is about a high-stakes cricket game, inherently political and involving power dynamics because the colonial administrators challenged some villagers to a cricket game, with the result of either tripling or removing taxes for the villagers. However, our group took note specifically of the love triangle in the movie surrounding Bhuvan, Gari, and Elizabeth. We were interested in it because we noticed the power dynamics playing out between these three people, noticing that gender, race, and culture all played a role in whether or not these individuals had or achieved power regarding the romantic relationships that play out in the movie.
Consequently, we are focused on one main scene, the scene in which Elizabeth confesses her love to Bhuvan, then Bhuvan reveals his love to Gauri, and then all three of them engage in a musical number about their love. We noticed that while there is some literature regarding colonial factors at play in Lagaan, there is not any literature that has analyzed the power dynamics in this love triangle. Our argument is that while Elizabeth does have some power because of her role as a white woman in the colonial administration, the strength of cultural difference and gender roles end up thwarting her power as she is unable to obtain her love interest, Bhuvan, ultimately. Our argument contributes to post-colonial studies because it offers an analysis of the power dynamics in these relationships, something that hasn't been done before.
Now, in our presentation, we would like to visualize our concept of power in Lagaan using a power meter, featuring each of the characters from the love triangle. Our focus is Elizabeth, and how her power is subject to change depending on who she is with and what she is taught to think. We'll guide you through the character's gain and loss of power over the course of the scene by using this power meter.
So Nair explains that the term subjectivity is, in Western thought, the sense of oneself as a unique, self-conscious, and autonomous and bounded entity. The West sees the subject as someone who understands clearly their separation from the world. However, many post-colonial scholars hold that the sense of self, one's subjectivity, can only be formed in contrast to the other, someone you register as not you. Philosopher Emmanuel Levinas calls this other alterity, that which is outside the self, while the self is ipseity. Other post-colonial scholars take this philosophy to the colonial context, arguing that the European subject is only fully formed within the context of colonial rule. In this understanding, being a colonizer helps the European form their subjectivity. We study the character Elizabeth and notice that she is an example in action of this construction of European subjectivity in the colony. This is apparent when, before confessing her love to Bhuvan in the scene that we studied, she tells him that she has had no friends since childhood, and that's at 1 hour and 50 minutes. This statement is difficult to believe, and we argue that she actually has had friends, but because she could not fully ascertain her identity until she encountered alterity, she does not believe that she had friends until she met the Indians. Instead, she idealizes and romanticizes her newfound relationships with the villagers because they help her develop her subjectivity. So we view Elizabeth's romantic love for Bhuvan as a product of that. We don't believe it's an innocent love, but rather a byproduct of her romanticization of the Indian villagers because since she viewed them as alterity, she was able to develop her own ipseity or subjectivity in a way she was not able to before. In this way, Elizabeth's construction of her subjectivity is aided due to her position in the colony. This constitutes a way that her race gave her power and privilege. Because of this, we are moving her up on the power meter. Strikingly, after idealizing Indians so much in contrast to her own life, rather than defining her Englishness against that, Elizabeth actually desires to become Indian. This is displayed in the song where viewers see Elizabeth's dream of being Bhuvan's lover dressed as an Indian woman. Following that, Elizabeth is seen putting a bindi on her forehead, a sign of physically identifying herself with Indian culture. We think it's important to note this because it is a way our analysis has augmented post-colonial understandings of the way the European subject functions in the colony. Rather than just using the natives to grow a clear understanding of her identity, Elizabeth romanticizes the way they've helped her build her identity so much that she actually wants to become like them. Using the terminology of Emmanuel Levinas, Elizabeth prizes alterity for the way it helps her recognize her ipseity, so she actually wants to remodel her ipseity to become more like alterity. This moves Elizabeth down the power meter because she wants to make herself like the colonized group, who are less powerful in this situation than the English. Something else that Nair says about the subjectivity of Europeans in the colonial period is that European women are often able to assert their agency in the colony in ways that they never could back home, due to the usual disadvantages suffered by their gender in Europe. Again, we see this come to life in Lagaan. In the movie, whenever she's with English people, she has to remain quiet, and when she disagrees with them, she can usually only mumble. Examples of this are when she's eating with the king and her brother, and when she watches cricket with other English people. This moves her down the power meter a lot. As a woman in English society, she suffers a lot of disadvantages. In contrast, when she's with the villagers, she has total freedom to have her own personality and opinions. She becomes someone she wasn't even allowed to before, so this bumps her up the power meter. Furthermore, in helping and befriending the Indian villagers, Elizabeth escapes and defies her controlling brother who forbids her from seeing the villagers. So we view Elizabeth's act of helping the villagers as an act of defiance that benefits her in providing her the agency that she never had before because of her gender. This moves her up the power meter. Her excitement about this newfound agency and liberation is reflected in her elated singing and dancing about her love for Bhuvan, smiling gleefully and even stretching out her arms in a way that contrasts her usual characteristically English stiffness. So we read her love in this scene as, in reality, her excitement about her newfound freedom pasted onto a narrative that she's in love. This love is a site where she gets to express her agency and freedom, so she moves up the power meter. By the end of the scene, Elizabeth is openly defiant towards her brother, telling him that she'll continue to visit the village despite his prohibition. That she develops her subjectivity and sense of purpose in the colony enough to assert herself against a man in that day and age, which is an act of great agency, illustrates the extent and the effects of the agential power an English woman could enjoy in the British colonies. So we'll raise her up on the power meter. Although it is important to note that in the colony, she is just making up for lost power because of her gender due to being a European woman.
Alright, so far Elizabeth is doing well. Being a member of the dominating ruling class certainly helps. I'm going to be talking about cultural bias and how that hinders her agency. You see, Nair uses non-Europeans as his example for defining agency. However, I feel like this provides insight into the condition of the woman colonist as well. Nair defines agency as the ability to make decisions and then carry through with these decisions within existing social structures. Elizabeth's decision to teach the villagers, for example, while it was against her brother's will, is supported by existing social structures because she is taking on the role of the colonial administrator and is teaching them British cultural practices, namely cricket. However, her relationship with Bhuvan is romantic, which is considered a source of anxiety for colonial administrators. You see, interracial union at the time was considered a contamination of the ruling race. And so Elizabeth, as a woman in 1893, suffers from rejectment, marginalization, and humiliation from her fellow peers. She has internalized the notion that interracial union is wrong, making it difficult for her to confess to Bhuvan in her confession scene. This struggle to confess moves her down in the scale. Now, I'm sure we're all used to hearing Derek Walcott's sentiment, "No language is neutral." Well, this applies to Elizabeth's confession scene as well, where she turns away and says, don't say it, then confesses in English. Using the language of the ruling class reminds them both of their power dynamics, and so she moves up in the scale. Additionally, she refers to him as Bhuvan, whereas he still refers to her as Madame, showing her authority in his eyes and so moving her up again in the scale. Finally, she calls him a good man, and when she does, he looks away, looks down, and smiles awkwardly. He has already been treated as inferior and emasculated, and so her praise means little, and she moves up again. Cultural biases show not only in the internalization of the characters, but also promoted in the film itself. Lagaan promotes same culture relationships by pairing Bhuvan and Gari together in the singing scene, where they ride together in an ox cart in lands unaffected by British exploits, whereas Elizabeth sings alone in her manicured mansion. The film also tries to shock the viewer by suddenly putting one character from one culture into another as though they were perfectly assimilated. This jars the reality the viewer has already created. I think that Gandhi did a much better job of showing conversion from one culture to another by showing Madeleine already in her traditional robes in a humble fashion, whereas Elizabeth is dressing in this way in order to feed her fantasies. The movie humiliates Elizabeth by suddenly dropping her into this unfamiliar culture, and thus she moves down in the scale.
Okay, so bearing all that in mind, I now want to bring our attention to the concept of infantilization and how this has the ability to thwart any power Elizabeth has gained so far from her culture. As described by Nair, the term infantilization refers to the conversion of the native from a free subject with agency into a helpless, non-threatening individual. Not only can this implied power relation between the adult white and the child native apply to the case of Elizabeth and Bhuvan, but the idea of Elizabeth's gender roles exposing her to the effects of infantilization can also be seen in the interactions between Elizabeth and her brother Andrew, and then again later between Bhuvan and Gari. Elizabeth and Andrew present a unique situation in that they are of the same culture, meaning that Elizabeth does not have her cultural power to fall back on. But we'll get more to that later. First, I want to talk about Elizabeth's relationship with Bhuvan, as it is clear that Elizabeth's cultural identity provides her with a certain degree of power. We've already covered how Elizabeth and Bhuvan exemplify some of the differences in the cultures of the Western and colonized worlds. We would think that this would guarantee Elizabeth a comfortable lead on the scale. However, there is a hitch. While Elizabeth's cultural identity provides her with a degree of power, we see any power she gains through her culture to be thwarted as soon as Bhuvan's gender roles come into play. The fact that Bhuvan is a male, and a male of another culture no less, presents a major reason as to why they cannot and do not end up together. As Chelsea Hewitt says, because most cultures categorize women and men as being different via gender stereotypes, it creates a justification for the inequality of treatment. This logic makes clear the fact that Bhuvan and Elizabeth's marriage would bring about a brand new set of restrictions that would ultimately see Elizabeth's cultural power overshadowed by the power Bhuvan gains from being a male. Hewitt's essay also contains information that can be applied to the situations Elizabeth finds herself in involving her brother Andrew. Because Western culture has a gender classification that adheres to preconceived and rigid limitations based on what is socially acceptable for each gender, we can analyze Andrew's treatment of Elizabeth by saying that while their cultural power and bias sees them as equals, Andrew Russell is ultimately aided by the ability gender roles provide him with to infantilize Elizabeth. Strongly believing himself to be the more dominant of the two, Andrew even goes so far as to tell Elizabeth, "I'm not going to tolerate your nonsense anymore," and "You'll pack your bags, is that clear?" These quotes clearly contain infantilizing words, and Andrew's tendency to discipline his sister gives him the upper hand. Okay, so with all that in mind, it is fair to say that the ways in which Bhuvan and Gari interact also demonstrate how gender roles can inspire infantilization. I think we can all agree that referring to Gari as "silly girl" and "my pretty one" shows that Bhuvan does not have any trouble asserting the power his gender assigns him. The term "girl" has especially significant suggestions behind it, which Heather MacArthur claims connotes immaturity, frivolity, innocence, and irresponsibility, and when used to describe an adult woman, signifies that women are physically and intellectually weak, as well as incapable of taking responsibility to make important decisions. It is safe to say that these possessive terms see Gari's power levels decreasing, and Bhuvan secures a comfortable lead.
Okay, looking at the power meters, it is safe to say that Elizabeth is certainly not where she started off. Neither is Bhuvan, for that matter. Let's recap how the final standings came to be. First, Elizabeth's position within the colony introduces her to all the benefits of her status as a European. Her power within the colony aids her in developing her subjectivity. However, where this begins to fall through is her desire to become more like the less culturally powerful Indian villagers.
Next, we are reminded of what it means to be a woman at this time for Elizabeth. It does not mean good things for her, and she struggles for power even when surrounded by the villagers. Her interactions with Bhuvan remind us of her authority, however lowers her chances of romantic relationships because of this power dynamic. This is accented in her confession in English, as it is the language of the ruling class.
Gender biases prove to be the undoing of Elizabeth, however, and once we are introduced to the infantilization her gender roles would bring upon her in a marriage, it is clear why Bhuvan comes out of this section victorious. Cultural bias is no match against gender bias. Add Andrew's ability to insert his dominant gender roles, and Elizabeth really does not stand a chance. Andrew and Bhuvan end up as two examples of characters who are not hesitant to infantilize those belonging even to their own culture. Thank you guys so much for watching our presentation. Our questions for further reflection are included in our handout, and we are really interested to see your guys' answers.